All right, so a question that comes up from time to time online, whether it be in sword forums or on the sword subreddit, a lot of people who are new to sword collecting or looking to be first-time buyers want to know what they're supposed to look for when they're looking to buy a sword. And that's a good idea. As a good consumer, you want to make sure that you are spending your money wisely. And there's a lot of misinformation out there. So I figured I would do this video, rather long and comprehensive video, to speak to some of the things that you should know about swords when you're going to buy them. Now this video is really going to be off the cuff. Usually I do scripted videos. This one is not so much, so there'll be a lot of me rambling. I do have notes here in hand so I can make sure that I stay on topic as best as possible. But because this is a long video, I got a few things I feel like I need to say in this introduction. First off, I will be focusing mostly on medieval European swords. That's obviously an interest of mine. Some of the things that I speak to will apply and can be applicable to Asian swords such as katanas, as well as Middle Eastern swords and the such. But really, my focus again, and you'll see that later on in the video, is European medieval. So I'm going to be speaking a lot to that. This is mostly going to be focused on production style swords, not really antiques. So this is kind of the more modern era when you're doing online shopping. Again, because it's a long video, I'm going to throw in a couple of good features. So over to the side here, I will be right about now throwing up a scene selection menu, so you can jump to the parts of the video that might be more interesting to you, or you can jump to them to refer to them later. So you can kind of skip past the parts you either already know or don't care to really learn about. Additionally, to make the point set in and also make this video a bit more interesting, in the second half I will be speaking to my own personal collection, which I think is a pretty common thing you'll see on people who have been collecting swords for a while but also learned from their mistakes. I have a lot of swords from a lot of different ranges in terms of quality, and so I will kind of show them and speak to them and speak to why they are good swords and why they aren't. And then, of course, be referring back to the things that I cover in the kind of introductory parts of this video. So this is really just a sword collector's guide, kind of 101, the really basic information you need to know as either a first-time buyer or someone who doesn't know a lot about swords yet. I hope that you'll walk away from this video knowing a whole lot more. So we will get started with kind of the first part, just introduction to swords in general. So one of the first things you need to know, being either a first-time sword buyer or if you're new to sword collecting, is that the rule caveat emptor really applies. That is, of course, buyer beware. And you as a consumer need to be very, very well versed in what makes a sword a good sword for whatever type of sword you're buying. Because there is a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of that misinformation comes from both the manufacturer and the reseller of certain types of swords. And that applies especially to certain types of buzzwords. Good example of that being the term battle ready. Battle ready doesn't really mean much. In the sword community, it means that, hey, this is a sword that is a good sword, I can use it, and I'm not afraid of it breaking, I'm not afraid of it injuring me because of faulty construction or bad metal, etc. But as a term, it doesn't really mean anything within the industry in terms of resellers and manufacturers, because it doesn't necessarily mean that this sword has met any type of prerequisites or requirements. So they're able to just claim something as battle ready, and there's not really anything stopping them from doing that. So you have to be really, really careful when you see that term and understand what websites use it properly and what don't. And certainly if you're at either a Renaissance festival or a sword blade show or whatever, that you're aware that resellers might even use this term again there, and you just have to ignore that, start looking at the details of the sword that are important to know that they are actually truly battle ready and that they are good swords, well constructed swords. Real quickly on the topic of terminology, one of the common terms I will use throughout this video is SLO. It means sword-like object. It looks like a sword, but it's not really a sword, doesn't really meet the construction requirements. And I will use that interchangeably with the term wall hanger. So again, if I'm talking about a decorative only sword, not something you can expect to be able to use, I'll use either SLO or wall hanger. So let's go over sword terminology real quick. Real basic stuff. I'm just going to be using these terms a lot throughout the video, so I want to make sure I cover it. Obviously, you have the blade. In HEMA, we refer to the tip to about the center point as the weak, and from the center point down to the crossguard as being the strong of the blade. Probably don't need to know that if you're just collecting. Here, everything from the crossguard to the pommel is called the hilt. So when you hear hilt, that's what it means. It means all this stuff. It also is commonly referred to as the sword furniture or the hilt assembly. Here you have the crossguard, and it's often called the quillon, the handle or the grip, and the pommel, sometimes called an end cap based on the type of sword it is. So those are the common parts of a sword that you, generally speaking, would refer to, and I will be using that terminology throughout the video. So let's talk a moment about the construction of a sword. I'm going to use a Rawlings synthetic practice sword as my example, just so I can point things out and talk about how it's constructed. One of the most important features of a blade is this portion right here. It's called the tang. You'll see it in terminology a lot. You'll hear full tang, and what that means is that the blade is one solid piece going all the way through, where the handle would be all the way to the end cap, the pommel. So there are full tang swords that can have different variations, such as this one, as you will see as I construct it. As I put it back together, the cross guard would go on it. The handle will go on it. All right, so there's the grip. And then in this case, because it goes together like this, it has a screw top pommel. Right, so it just screws on. So you'll see that there are, within even functional swords, there are some swords that use a screw-on pommel. We will use this one right behind me here as an example of that. So this sword, the pommel will actually screw off. And so it doesn't mean that it's a bad sword. It just means that that's how it's constructed. And what is important to know about the tang is that the tang can have different variations, and some are better than others, and some are avoided at all cost. So one of the ones that is avoided at all cost is half tang. And what that means is the tang doesn't go actually all the way through the grip. It only goes about halfway, and so it's not a solid piece, which means it could come loose and break very easily. Another thing to avoid is a welded on tang, which means that the blade was made as one piece and they kind of just welded on a bolt, as it were, so they could put it all together, and that's very dangerous. You see that very commonly in SLOs, especially made of stainless steel. It's a way to quickly construct the blade and put it onto a different type of grip very quickly, and it's an avoid at all cost. So when you're looking for a good sword, you want to look for one that has full tang. That's very important. But even within full tang, there are some variations you need to be aware of. Obviously, the screw-on pommel is a good example. Screw-on is not a bad thing as long as the tang is, full and proper and not welded. You will also see a nut version, which is where instead of having the pommel screw on, you actually have a nut that compresses everything together. And I'll speak to that much later in this video. You also then, of course, have glued, which is very dangerous, but also very common. A lot of companies like to just glue all the bits together. Again, this is very common. You'll see this a lot in the SLO wall hanger decorative swords. So you want to be really careful to make sure you're not getting a glued hilt assembly when you're getting the sword. The ideal, in my opinion, always ideal, and I think this is not just my opinion, this is probably fact at this point, is that you want to have a peened pommel. And what that means is That tang goes all the way up through the pommel. It's then heated and beat down like a rivet so that the steel of the blade is all one solid piece that holds the entire hilt assembly together. Obviously, one of the most important aspects of a sword is the metal that it's made from. There are a lot of different types of metal that a sword can be made from, and most commonly steel is used, and even within steel there are just a ton of different variations. So I'm going to try to touch a little bit on those variations, what you need to know about them. Um, I'm going to cover three basic types of steel, which is going to be stainless steel, spring steel, and high carbon steel. And I'll throw in a fourth bonus in the very end, just kind of as a notation. I'm going to be talking to the SAE standard. I'm going to put a link in the video description to the SAE standard. It's a Wikipedia entry. It's good for just kind of basic research and knowledge. So go check that out. What I will tell you is that most steels in the SAE standard have usually a 4-digit number. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5. That number represents information about the steel. Usually the first number or 2 numbers is the main alloying agent and the secondary alloying agent respectively. And the last 2 numbers are the carbon content in the steel. And that carbon content, that number is representative as a percentage of 100th. Speaking first to stainless steel, the most common one is 440. 440 steel is a really good steel for like cutlery and small knives. It's used really common in kitchen knives, but it doesn't work well for swords because 2 main features of stainless steel is that it's rigid and it's brittle. So it breaks very easily and it doesn't bend. That's really a bad thing for swords. Swords need to be both flexible as well as able to take that bend without breaking. The advantage of stainless steel is that it doesn't rust very easily. It's very low upkeep, which is again why it's used in a lot of kitchen knives. So it's really good for decorative swords, for the SLOs. So if you're buying a sword you're going to hang on the wall as decoration, by all means go get a 440 steel sword. Just never try to use it. And certainly if you own one, please don't try. It will be to your own detriment. It will break, it will injure you. The next type of steel that I'll cover is spring steel. Usually it's a chromium steel, spring steel is. A very common one is 5160. 5160 steel, when it's heat treated properly, it's flexible, it's rugged, it's sturdy, and it will have a good hardness to it, so it won't be soft and it will always kind of snap back to its position. So if you see 5160 steel, it's a good steel as long as it's obviously heat treated properly. That really applies to both that and high carbon steel. For high carbon steel, there's kind of a good range that's pretty common. You see either anywhere from 1055 to about 1075. So it's 1055, 1065, 1075. Those type of steels are really good. The more carbon content, the harder it will be, but usually the less flexible. In general, if it's within that range, it's perfectly good for a sword. If you go too far above or below it, it may not be quite as good of a steel for a sword. So just be aware that when you see a high carbon steel, it falls within the range of 1055 to 1075, usually best. Finally, one of the more common things you hear out there is Damascus steel. Damascus is a buzzword. Be careful about that. Usually the better term to look for is pattern welded. Pattern welded swords are using either different types of swords or different types of metal, or the same type of metal, but it's twisted and beat down and twisted again, so it creates this really beautiful pattern when it's finished. But be careful of the term Damascus, because Damascus doesn't necessarily mean a type of steel. It might just mean that somebody has taken stainless steel and added a pattern welded look to it, but it's still just stainless steel. So you got to be really careful about that. So that's just kind of a quick side note. Really common when you're wanting to get the pattern welded, that you won't be able to find that in a production sword. You'll usually have to get that made. So while we're on the topic of steel, we need to cover tempering and heat treating. Steel in and of itself has a lot of different properties, and based on how you heat and cool it, it can take on different forms and different properties. And the ideal for a sword is that it's flexible, it's strong, and it can retain an edge. And the flexibility obviously means retention of shape, that it doesn't bend and stay bent. So through the process of tempering and heat treating, you can get a steel to be, uh, those three things. Um, Tempering is really the process of quenching. You see this very commonly in a lot of movies and whatnot. It's where you heat up the blade and you plunge it into not often water. Sometimes people use water, but really it should be oil or something like oil. Um, and what this process does, when you heat up a sword, you heat it up to what's called the critical, or sorry, not the sword, the blade. When you heat up the blade, you heat it up to what's called the critical temperature. And that's where the molecules of the steel kind of expand and get to the point where, based on how it is cooled after the critical temperature, it will take on certain properties. So if you heat it and just kind of let it cool slowly, it'll be kind of a bendy, it will retain, it will bend to whatever you want it to be. It'll be soft. It won't really be what you want it to be for a blade. But if you quench it, what happens is those molecules contract very rapidly, and it creates what is actually a brittle but also hard steel. So it's not quite good for a blade yet when you've quenched it. It has to then go through the follow-up process of heat treating. So it's a quick hardening when you're talking about quenching in terms of tempering. Heat treatment is where we would then take this strong and brittle blade and begin to reintroduce the flexibility and toughness back into the steel. So the way this is generally done is you heat the steel up to, it's not the critical temperature, it's actually well below the critical temperature, but you're heating it up to where it's beginning to change its properties again, away from just being brittle and hard, and you will reintroduce the flexibility and the toughness there, so it won't be as brittle. Usually with steel, it's between 5 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm using Fahrenheit there, whereas a critical temperature might be something like 1600 degrees. And by bringing it to that high temperature and then letting it cool naturally, either burying it in sand or just letting it cool off in the air, it will, over a couple of courses of that, so you'd heat it and let it cool and heat it and let it cool, maybe 3 or 4 times, it will suddenly go from being that really hard brittle to being slightly less hard, but still hard enough, and it'll be flexible and tough, and that's the type of blade quality steel you'd want after the tempering and heat treating. So it's a really, really pretty basic process. Any good bladesmith knows how to do this really well, but it's also something that there's a lot of, in a way, a lot of mystery behind, and so it's something that can confuse a lot of people. So just understand what that process is, and that it is important for having a good sword. So let's talk about quality levels of swords and the prices that you'll tend to see them fall in online. SLO wall hanger decorative swords, they tend to have a pretty broad range, but they're always on the low end. So you can get a decorative sword from anywhere from $10 to a couple $100. And there are certain brands that will artificially inflate that price by adding gold leafing and things like that. But what's important to know is when it's an SLO, when it's a wall hanger, when it's made of 440 steel, it's not going to be something you want to use. And that price, you're just buying something to put on your walls to make sure you're only spending the money you're really wanting to for that. Very common to see a lot of like movie replica swords, things like that fall into that category. The next category has a price range of about $200 to $600. Sometimes goes a little bit higher than that, but really shouldn't. And that's stage quality swords. These are swords that aren't well constructed, aren't well balanced, aren't necessarily made with kind of actual truly functional use in mind. It's made to take a beating day after day on stage. And it's going to have proper heat treating and things like that, but you'll see these get made out of a lot of different types of materials. So sometimes it's steel, sometimes it's aluminum. So you got to be really careful about those. Not quite as common online, but there are a few brands that I will cover later on that do sell kind of the stage quality swords. Again, these are not great swords. They're not well balanced. They're not all that wonderful. But if you're looking to use something for stage performance, hey, it's perfect. Finally, there's the functional side, and within the truly functional, battle-ready style sword, there are kind of three major categories of price ranges. There's the low end, which I would say is about $200 to $300. Sometimes it can dip a little bit lower to about $150. But $300 is about the maximum for the low end. You have mid end, which is about $300 to $800, and you have high end, which is usually above $800. The important thing to note here is that whether or not you're buying a low end or a high end, they will be functional, but they won't be nearly as nice if it's a low end compared to a high end, which will be like the Ferrari of swords, right? So it'll be really amazing at the high end, not so amazing at the low end. And again, a lot of this is you get what you pay for. So when you're looking at functional swords, understand there are certain brands that kind of target these different price ranges, and it's hard to find, the high end for cheap ever. So just be aware of that. So let's talk a little bit about manufacturers. I'm going to be listing off a lot of manufacturers here. I'm going to throw them up on screen. So I'm going to speak first off to the no-name manufacturer. These are manufacturers that come out of either China, Pakistan, or India. And these are swords that won't have a maker's mark on them. They won't have any identifying information. They are mass produced very quickly and shipped off to the US to be sold. These are almost always decorative swords. They're almost always made of that stainless steel, and they're almost always extremely low in price. So if you can't identify a manufacturer, if a reseller doesn't have that information, be aware it's probably not a good sword. Probably avoid at all costs. Even ones that are handmade should have a maker's mark and have a name associated with it. For the SLO side of things, some very, very common manufacturers that you see is United Cutlery, and actually Bud K has some swords that they make. And there is also some higher end SLO in Marto. But again, I'm not going to speak a lot to these manufacturers. Be aware, 440 steel, avoid. But there are some named manufacturers out there that do the decorative swords. For the kind of stage steel level swords, there is actually a brand called Stage Steel, oddly enough. There's also Starfire swords. Starfire would probably lead you to believe that they make kind of fully functional swords, but really they're only good for stage steel. And there are a few other brands out there, but again, I'm not going to cover too much the stage quality swords because I think it's important as a collector. You should really go after the fully functional swords, the ones that are well and truly properly made. So within the functional swords, you will of course have the low end swords. Manufacturers that tend to make swords kind of in that low end are Windlass, Hanway, Strong Blade is one. And I would actually say Cold Steel tends to be on the low end in quality, not necessarily in price. And so their price range tends to nudge them up into saying that they're the medium range. But I think, based on the quality of their swords, I think they're actually kind of the more low end. So I think you're getting something about as good as you'd get from Hanway or Windlass when you're buying a Cold Steel sword. But you might be paying a little bit more for the name brand there. Certainly in medium, I would categorize Dark Sword Armory as being a medium level sword manufacturer. Their price range is usually reasonable, and their swords are really very good most of the time. And they're that kind of mid-range price. The high end are a lot of my favorite brands. You have Christian Fletcher. You have the Arms and Armor blades there within. You have Fable blades is not so much a production style sword. Those are actually all handmade, but they're really high end. And you have, of course, Albion, which is one of my favorite in terms of production swords. They're going to always be very expensive, usually never below $800. But you can be guaranteed when you're buying a sword from one of those either production manufacturers or makers that you're getting a really, really good sword. So I'm going to talk a little bit about resellers real quick. Resellers are not people who make the swords, but they just sell them. So generally speaking, most resellers will sell multiple different manufacturers, different brands of swords. So keep in mind that when I'm talking about resellers, I'm not talking about the quality of swords so much, but there is kind of a reliability factor. I'm only going to mention websites that I have personally purchased from, and I've had at least, at the very least, a decent experience. I've gotten my product. I won't mention websites that I haven't ever purchased from. Um, I will say that the first two, I am ashamed to admit that I did actually purchase things from them before, but I hadn't purchased swords. I know better than that. But these two companies are True Swords and Bud K. They sell a lot of different things. Again, I wouldn't buy a sword from them, but they are at least reliable. They will actually send you the thing you buy. I will say True Swords is actually based out of the state that I'm in, so they're actually pretty close by, so they ship to me very quickly. So I haven't really had bad experiences with them, but keep in mind that when you're purchasing from them, you're probably not purchasing a real sword. Strong Blade, I mentioned as a manufacturer, they also are a reseller. The benefit of buying a Strong Blade sword is that they actually have some selection items that you can't actually get anywhere else, and I'll talk to some of those later on in the video. Medieval Collectibles and a company called Buy the Sword, they both are pretty common resellers. They sell all sorts of medieval things, armor, clothing, boots, trinkets, decorative items, anything and everything, if it can be considered medieval, they tend to sell it. So that's Medieval Collectibles and Buy the Sword. You can get some decent items from them. Mostly, again, still a lot of decorative, so you have to be careful what you're buying from those sites if you're looking at swords. Finally, the kind of the last two that are probably more prominent that I buy from is Atlanta Cutlery, and they're also known as Museum Replicas. They almost exclusively sell windlass swords. Windlass as a manufacturer is really great because they have a wide selection, and so from Museum Replicas you have a pretty wide selection. The reason I actually purchased from them, yet again, is they are within the state that I live in, so not only can I purchase from them and get really quick shipping to my house, but I can just drive about an hour down the road and go into their storefront and browse their selection and buy from them. I'm not the biggest fan of windlass swords from a functionality standpoint, but their variety is really great, and their price point is really pretty low because they kind of bulk manufacture, but they still make good real swords that are actually functional. So two websites to look at there. And then finally, Cult of Athena is probably the biggest reseller with kind of the most community support. They are really good customer service. They offer sharpening services for all the swords that they can offer sharpening services on. And they do sell other things. They sell, again, clothing and whatnot. But I'm really a very big fan of Cult of Athena. I've purchased a lot of items from them. Tend to be items that are from more production standpoint. So I do buy some windlass from them. I've bought Hanways from them. But generally speaking, I don't buy a lot of the other brands from them because if I'm going to buy like an Arms and Armor, Christian Fletcher, and Albion, I'll probably actually go direct to the source for most of those so I can get exactly what I want. But yeah, that's it. Again, a reminder, generally speaking, you get what you pay for. And so I think if you stick to a lot of the resellers I speak to, especially Cult of Athena, you won't be disappointed. And if you stick to a lot of the brands that I tend to suggest and speak to, again, I don't think you'll be disappointed. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to kind of walk through my experience of collecting swords and talk about some of the pitfalls and really speak to what it is like from the very beginning in the kind of the age of the internet, trying to find swords online to buy and trying to wade through the misinformation. And you'll see that early on I made a lot of mistakes, and it was only through a very slow progression that I learned what's a good sword and what isn't, and that quality is abundantly clear. I've been doing this for more than a decade, collecting swords, so I have a pretty large collection, and I hope that you will learn from my mistakes. But I think this is kind of a fun show and tell portion as well, because I like all my swords and I like to show them to people. So we'll go through that next. So, the early years of collecting swords. I started back in about 1999. Was when I first had the burgeoning interest in pretty much everything medieval, and I was really wanting to buy everything I could get my hands on. I was a high school student at the time. Money was tight, so I would spend the minimum amount of money to get a sword. So I'll show you the first sword that I bought. It is a claymore, kind of. Um, it is stainless steel. You can see it's got some rusting on it here. I haven't taken great care of it because it's kind of a crappy sword. It has one of the telltale items to know that you're getting a really crappy kind of flea market style sword, and that is this amazingly crappy leather sheath. You'll see these type of things come with crappy, poorly made swords all the time. It is stainless steel, like I said. It's really poorly constructed. You can see by how offset the handle and the crossguard is that it is really poorly constructed. Same thing actually with the pommel right here. It's really something awful. Yeah, not the best sword. Certainly not functional. I'm pretty sure it has a welded tang. I'm actually afraid to take this thing apart to check it out, because I'm afraid not only will go together worse after I've tried to reassemble it, but I'm afraid I'd probably end up breaking it. So that was the first sword I bought. It was about $15 with $15 shipping off of eBay back in 1999. Couldn't tell you who the manufacturer is because there really isn't one. This is one of those swords I was talking about. Continuing on with the absolutely crappy swords that I have purchased, I bought this one off of eBay. I don't know what this is. In fact, I honestly don't even remember buying it because I don't know why I would have. It's really just terrible. It has this kind of weird back edge sharpened piece, but then it's thick across the spine. I think it was supposed to be a ninja sword, but then it got confused and became a fantasy sword. Again, this is like a screw-on pommel, just like the claymore was. It's not necessarily put together all that well, as you can see. It's not even straight. I mean, you can maybe see I'm holding it horizontal in my grip, but you can see that the blade kind of tilts down. So it's not something that is perfectly straight, as you can see. Really, again, terrible construction. But that is what you get when you spend $10 on a sword on eBay. Again, probably a $20 purchase. I don't, again, know what this is supposed to be. It's obviously stainless steel. Look how poorly constructed the tip is here. It's really terrible. This is a single edge for whatever reason. I think it's supposed to be mildly Asian in design, I guess, was supposed to be intent, kind of like a katana, straight-edged ninja sword. But honestly, what I call it is the salt and pepper shaker, because it really looks like just a pepper grinder. I don't know, a sword for Olive Garden, I suppose. So those are some of the crappy swords I purchased. And it was about that time that I was like, you know what? I know these aren't good swords. What are good swords? And so I started looking around. Again, the internet back then didn't have a lot of options. So I began to go to like Renaissance festivals and try to find things there. And that's where I would come across some other varieties. But before I get to kind of the slightly better swords, I'll talk a little bit about decorative swords and swords I have purchased after I knew better. But I still wanted the sword for some reason. A good example is here. This is my Sting sword. I'm a huge Lord of the Rings fan. This is actually a United Cutlery sword. United Cutlery had the rights to make the official swords for Lord of the Rings. It is stainless steel. Obviously, it's got the nice inscriptions and everything on them, and it's fairly well made. And I have a sheath that comes with it, but it hangs on my wall. Again, this is not a real blade. I believe that these are actually half tang, so the tang probably ends right about here. Again, not like I would use this, but it's something to note. The construction on it is really pretty tight, though. United Cutlery does a good job with their decorative swords of at least constructing them well, even though the material isn't all that great. Similarly, enjoying Harry Potter, I have the Sword of Gryffindor here. Again, this one is not an official one, I believe, and it really shows. I got it for $10 in an auction. I guess it's worth $10. Again, it hangs on my wall. Kind of say, hey, I'm a nerd at heart, and I like things more than just strictly medieval weapons, even if they are very silly like this one. Moving on, I have a variety of other movie swords. I have a sword that is a crappy stainless steel replica from the Chronicles of Narnia movie, specifically Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I do have the Ranger Sword of Aragorn from Lord of the Rings. This one is, again, not an official one, so I got it for like $50 instead of $250. I have a really, really crappy rapier. This was actually a pawn shop buy. You can see I got it for about 20 bucks. Talked them down from 70. Somebody tried to sharpen it, and they didn't know what they were doing, so they really marred the blade. I've looked to actually try to find another blade to replace it with just so it would look a little bit nicer, but I've honestly given up on that. I just bought a new rapier instead, an actual good one. Let's see. I've also ended up with some really random swords like this one. I have no idea where this came from. I don't remember buying it. I don't remember it being given to me. It just showed up one day. And it's a cast hilt. It's got this really truly screw-on pommel. You can see where you just kind of throw in an Allen wrench and twist it. And it's got a little bit of decorative scrolling on the blade, but it is, I guess it's supposed to be ceremonial. I really am not certain. I do have some random decorative, like Templar swords that are overly ornate. This is actually one that is kind of a sister pairing to my friends. I bought them swords when they were my groomsmen at my wedding. So I got them decorative swords, and they were Templar swords because I could. I have this one, which is kind of a Celtic leaf blade style. This was actually given to me when I was a groomsman in a wedding for my cousin. It's, again, stainless steel. It's only really good for being decorative. Over here, I have a Marteau sword. Listen. Yeah, that's how you know a sword is really well constructed, right? It's funny though, because the blade actually looks decently okay. A little bit dusty here, but it's decently okay being a stainless steel, but you can see what's happened to the handle here over time. It's just gotten really terrible. Marteau are the, generally speaking, the expensive swords. This is the Excalibur sword. It was given to me by my cousin. He bought it actually in Spain when he was there. Marteau is based out of Spain, and he didn't want it anymore. He knew I collected swords, so he gave it to me. And I gladly accept anything that is a sword-like object, even if I can't use it. Being a big Legend of Zelda fan, I have a Master Sword. This one specifically has the red hilt because I like A Link to the Past, and the Link to the Past had a red hilt variant. And so, you know, being a nerd, I like these type of things. Again, stainless steel, not great. Certainly not functional. I do own one Kit Ray sword. This is the only one I ever liked. I liked it really for the blade design more than anything, because it kind of starts out thin at the neck, very fantasy design, gets wide, and has kind of the hexagon cross section. It's got a little bit of a loose hilt. It's not the greatest thing ever, but I figured I'm going to own at least one Kit Ray, so this would be it. This is the only one I really liked. I don't remember the name of it. I think it's like the Sword of Valaria or something, but it's not the greatest thing in the world. I do have a couple of other kind of big swords. I have, here, I'll just grab it. It takes a little bit of effort. This is the Dragon Slayer sword from the anime slash manga called Berserk. Obviously decorative. This thing is very heavy. It is stainless steel. It's a big sword. It's a big fantasy sword. I bought it because I'm a big fan of Berserk. And if you have never seen that, you should check it out. Additionally, I have a couple of other random nerdy things, such as a bat'leth and a gun blade from Final Fantasy. Again, decorative. So when I'm buying these things, I am highly aware that I am buying something that isn't very good, and I am very, very, very cognizant of the price of the sword or the blade that I'm buying, because it's just not going to be worth it if I can't use it. It's just going to sit there, and I like to use the swords. So that's it for kind of the low-end swords that I have. Again, I purchased most of those because I'm a fan of something, and of course the first couple I showed you was because I didn't know any better. I certainly know a lot better now, and I would never buy those first couple of swords ever. And certainly a lot of the decorative ones behind me here, I wouldn't normally buy them still, at least not at the price point that's usually asked, but I will buy them if they're a good deal. So I try to usually find them on the cheap. Alright, so let's look at some of the mid-range type swords that I have. I'm going to actually start with the stage steel style swords. So I actually, when I learned better about stainless steel and decorative swords, the first brand I came across that I really liked the way they looked, and I thought I knew enough about construction of swords and properties of swords, what makes a sword really great, to think that they were like the end-all be-all of swords, and that is Starfire swords. I still really like the look of them. I like simple designs. I've said that many times in my reviews. And I like the simple design of their swords, but they're really heavy, they're really thick blades. The steel's good enough, it's tempered and heat treated properly, but they're just not really all that functional. They are good stage steel swords. So I have their big meter-long two-handed sword. I have one of their daggers. Over in the corner I have one of their 32-inch long swords. And I also have a rigid broadsword from them. So I actually own 4 items that are Starfire swords, but I don't really consider them to be all that great anymore. So I own them because I like owning my swords, but I don't think I'd ever buy a Starfire sword again. I got other things I'd really want to spend the money on. So that's it for kind of the low mid-end. And then we can begin to talk about kind of the real swords I have. So real quick, I'll just show you this one. It's the only katana I own. This is a Sword Buyer's Guide custom katana. They have a forge that is based out of China, and you get to decide all the design features of the blade. And so I have, it's a fairly decent sword. It's properly constructed and properly weighted. And it's relatively expensive, but not too bad. It's definitely the low end as far as katanas go. And I'm not a big fan of Eastern swords, so I was perfectly happy with getting one that was custom made the way I would want it and just leaving it at that. In the future, maybe when I get more bored and I have way more medieval European swords than I would ever care to buy more of, then maybe I would move on to buying more Eastern and Middle Eastern influenced weapons, but I'm still pretty much going after all the European swords, as it were. Some other swords that are kind of the mid-range in terms of quality. I have a lot of windlass swords, like this is a windlass Brandenburg rapier. So speaking a little bit to how these swords are good, right? They have the flexibility, and they're strong, and they retain their edge. And that's important, again, for swords like this. you don't really bend a katana like the one I just showed you. It's going to be more rigid, and the steel is going to be a lot harder and have a much more focus on the edge than it would on being able to flex and bend and whatnot. And that's actually speaking a lot to the design that happens to these swords. Historically speaking, European swords would have a lot more flex. I do have a lot of windlass weapons, again because Museum Replicas is right down the road from me. So I have a little pirate cutlass here. Again, nothing too special. It flexes a bit. It's a pretty thick, rigid blade though, and it's a decent little sword. Again, windlass, pretty good brand if you're wanting to get a lot of variety and not wanting to spend too much money. They're a pretty good brand for that. I also have a windlass falcata. It's really heavy, but it's a really sturdy construction. It's actually one of the sturdiest constructions I think I've seen in a windlass sword, surprisingly. And it's a fairly decent blade. I've never actually used it because I'm not all that comfortable with this one because of the weight. I don't really know how to use it all that well. I've never done a cut test with it. Probably will if I ever do a review of it. Which would be true of any of the swords that I haven't done a review of that you're seeing. I will likely do cut tests with them. Of course, you have seen the ones I have done a review of, the Hanway Claymore and the Ritter Steel Landsknecht. I have them here. I'm not going to bother showing them now. You can go look at the videos. But they're good swords as well. But I am going to show you one more, but I have to go grab it. So, one more sword from Windlass that I just got recently, and I'm working on a review of it, is the Windlass Accolade sword. It's a pretty nice decorative sword in my opinion. I don't know so much about functionality, but I'll cover that in the review. Again, it's windlass though, so it has the flex and rigidity and strength and all that you would really need in a sword. So as you can see, I have a lot more windlass swords than anything. A lot of that has to do with their price. I like variety in my swords, and so I buy a lot of windlass swords because even though they're not the best quality, I can buy 3 or 4 of them for the price than of one really good sword. It's not to say I don't buy really good swords though. I actually have 3 Albions. One you have seen. That would be the Ringek. I did a review of that. It's actually my most watched video at this point. I really love this sword, and it speaks a lot when I start talking about the quality and the price difference and getting what you pay for. This sword in the hand, this sword functionally is so much greater than anything I have, except for maybe the other Albions I have. It speaks a lot that it's very important that you go for that really good construction. So I'm going to talk about construction of sword with this in hand. So again, you've got a nice blade. This is, I've been told, 1075 high carbon steel. I like that steel. I like it because I like the Albions. It's got a good, nice, solid crossguard, and I've shown it in the review, but of course the construction is very tight. There aren't gaps anywhere where the tang meets everything in the hilt assembly. Of course, the tang of the blade comes all the way through, up through the top of the pommel, and you can actually see a little bit, if I get it right in there, you can see maybe potentially the peen point, but they peen it down and then they really shine it up. So it is peened, it is a solid piece all the way through, and just good solid construction. And so you can't beat an Albion. Certainly, again, Arms and Armor, Christian Fletcher, Fable Blades. I know these guys make great swords. I plan on buying swords from every one of them at some point in the future, but I have a couple of Albions I still want to get. So I'm still working through my Albion phase, as it were, until I get everything that I really want. Another Albion sword that I do own, being a HEMA practitioner, I do actually have one of their Lichtenauer swords. It's blunt, it's got a little bit of a tip. A lot of the HEMA community I mean, they recognize that Albions are good swords, but these are actually not usable in a lot of competitions because Albion isn't rolling their tip. So it's still, even though it's blunted, it could still, some people are worried that it could injure them. So this is good for just kind of general practice and use, not so much for tournaments and probably not for full-on fighting. But man, this is a good solid sword. This was the first Albion I bought at the suggestion of my HEMA mentor back in the day, and I like it. It's a good sword. It's solid. So I would definitely advise people to get an Albion like Hour. Only if they really have the money. I would actually, for a HEMA perspective, I would suggest other types of swords, maybe a fader. And I won't speak to HEMA swords today because I do have a lot of HEMA practice swords, and that might be a whole separate video in the future. So I have one other sword that I like to show you because I believe it's kind of the pinnacle of my sword collecting thus far, and it might be the pinnacle forever because I really love this sword, and it speaks a lot to me, so that might be part of it. But you think back to that really crappy stainless steel Claymore that I purchased off of eBay 10 years ago. Well, compare that to the Albion Gallo Glass. This is a well-constructed, beautiful sword. It's made again of apparently a 1075 high carbon steel. It's got very similar construction to the Ringek. Of course, good peening. This one has an open pommel, so you can actually see the tang coming up through the center of the pommel to the peen block at the top. This is a beautiful sword. It feels so good. You begin to understand how a good sword differs from a really terrible sword-like object, or even just a really, really raw, basic, functional sword. This one is just amazing. These are truly the Ferraris of swords, and I'm enamored with this one. I love it. But it shows that you know, over 10 years I've been purchasing swords, and there's actually a lot that I haven't shown you. I have, looking over here in the corner, I have a Gladius. I have a Masonic Order. It's really like a Knights of Columbus sword. And I have some other various odds and ends that I haven't shown you. I don't think it's necessary to show all of them, but you can see there's been a progression over 10 years. I have slowly refined my understanding of what a good sword is, and I've only been buying Albions recently, only within the past 2 years, because I was only actually, oddly enough, I was only really aware of them as of a couple of years ago, which is really unfortunate because I wish more people were aware of them. Certainly not just within the sword community. I think the sword community does know about Albion, but I wish people more and more outside of the sword community would be aware of just what a high quality sword really is. And that's really, again, the point of this video, the point of all this, if you're still sticking around at this point, it's not just about Albion, it's about good swords. The Christian Fletchers, the Arms and Armors, the Dark Sword Armories even. A good sword is worth saving up the money for. It's worth waiting for. And I think for a sword collector, I would certainly say I have all these swords, but having one really good sword over having 10 or 15 not so good swords, I'd much rather have just the one. It's worth it. So keep that in mind and remember all the things I've talked about, and certainly I might do follow-up videos to this if I feel like there's things that I've missed speaking to, but hopefully I think you're better prepared to actually go out and start purchasing swords on your own. So good luck in the search. Oh, real quick, before you go, leave a comment down below if there's a certain sword that you saw in this video that you'd like me to do a review of. I'll do my best to prioritize.